The room was small, windowless, and smelled faintly of old smoke and ink. Men sat around a scarred table, coats still on, voices low. Harlem was spoken like a problem, not a place. And Bumpy Johnson's name carried weight even there. No one raised their voice. Orders like this never required noise. A finger tapped once on the table. 9 men, chosen for reliability, not courage. Each had done violence before. Each believed numbers settled things. They were told the streets were tired. They were told the man was aging. They were told tonight would be simple. Maps were unfolded, then folded again. Routes were suggested, then dismissed. Harlem did not need directions. The only instruction that mattered was the name. Bumpy Johnson. Say it quietly. Don't repeat it outside the room. There was an expectation in the air, unspoken but shared. Blood would answer blood. A reputation would end the way most reputations did, suddenly, and far from witnesses who mattered. The men accepted this without ceremony. Some smiled. Most didn't. What none of them said, but all of them felt, was hesitation. Not fear. Respect. The kind that lingers even when orders are clear. Bumpy Johnson had outlasted louder men. He had survived chaos by refusing it. That made him unpredictable. The decision was sealed not with a handshake, but with silence. Chairs scraped back. Coats were adjusted. One by one, the 9 men left the room, carrying certainty like armor. Behind them, the city waited. Harlem was already awake. And somewhere inside it, Bumpy Johnson was still breathing, still listening, still very much in control. The order had been given, and consequences were already moving toward them quietly. Harlem did not need sirens to announce danger. It felt it the way a body feels weather before it changes. A pause in laughter. A glance held a second longer than usual. Shoes slowing on familiar steps. Word traveled without words. Bumpy Johnson did not summon anyone. He never had to. His authority lived in memory, debts settled fairly, lines never crossed, protection given without spectacle. People knew what to do because they knew who he was. Barbers paused mid-conversation. Shop owners lowered their voices. Men on stoops shifted their weight, not to run, but to stay visible. This was their neighborhood. It had survived worse than 9 strangers with intentions. Bumpy moved through Harlem that day like any other. No escort. No tension in his shoulders. He listened more than he spoke. When someone greeted him, he answered softly. When someone hesitated, he met their eyes and nodded. That was enough. He understood power as something shared. You didn't announce it. You built it, year by year, favor by favor, restraint by restraint. Harlem trusted him because he never forced loyalty. He earned it. Somewhere, the 9 men were already stepping onto streets that did not belong to them. They would see nothing unusual at first. Just a city going about its business. Children playing too close to traffic. Music leaking from open windows. Old men arguing about yesterday's game. What they wouldn't see was how the city closed around them. Doors that usually stayed open were suddenly shut. Corners that welcomed strangers turned quiet. Faces that smiled at everyone remained blank. Bumpy did not give instructions. He didn't need to. His people knew the rules: no panic, no unnecessary violence, no mistakes. Harlem would not become a battlefield. It would become a mirror. In his apartment, Bumpy sat still, hands folded, listening to the city breathe. He knew the difference between chaos and pressure. Chaos shouted. Pressure waited. This wasn't about survival anymore. That had been settled long ago. This was about reminding the outside world that Harlem was not open territory. That respect was not optional. That numbers meant nothing without permission. By the time the sun lowered and shadows stretched longer across Lenox Avenue, the city was ready. Calm. Alert. Loyal. And the men who came hunting would soon understand something they had never been told. They did not arrive together. That was the first rule. 9 men, 9 paths, 9 assumptions that separation meant safety. They dressed like the city, walked like they belonged, kept their hands free and their eyes moving. Professionals always believed distance protected them. At first, Harlem looked ordinary. Too ordinary. The streets were alive, but not careless. People noticed them without staring. Conversations ended just before they passed. Laughter softened, then returned a moment later, like a curtain briefly drawn. One man stopped at a corner cafe and ordered coffee he didn't finish. Another leaned against a lamppost too long, pretending to check his watch. 2 crossed paths without acknowledging each other, trained to act like strangers. Still, something pressed on them. A weight without shape. They began to realize no one asked questions. No one offered directions. No one challenged them either. That was worse. Violence they understood. Silence unsettled them. Every block felt measured. Every step seemed recorded, not by eyes alone, but by memory. Harlem remembered who belonged and who didn't. The men sensed it in small things, a door closing as they approached, a shopkeeper turning his back, a child being gently pulled indoors. One of them noticed a man sweeping the same patch of sidewalk again and again, eyes never lifting. Another caught his reflection in a storefront window and felt watched from behind without seeing anyone there. They checked their weapons quietly. Reassurance rituals. Cold metal against skin. Still, confidence thinned. Numbers no longer felt solid. 9 men meant nothing if the ground itself refused them. They had expected resistance, maybe fear. Instead, they were being absorbed, surrounded without contact. Harlem did not confront. It observed. It waited. Messages failed to arrive. Signals went unanswered. They told themselves this was coincidence. Cities interfered with plans all the time. Yet each man, alone with his thoughts, felt the same realization forming. This place was not neutral. By nightfall, movement became harder. Streets narrowed. Paths looped back. A wrong turn placed one man on a block he was sure he'd already crossed. Another noticed the same faces appearing too often, always at a distance, never close enough to challenge. The city was guiding them without touching them. Somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson remained still. He did not rush the moment. Pressure worked best when allowed to mature. The men felt it now, an invisible tightening, patient and controlled. They were no longer hunters. They were being sorted. And with every quiet step they took deeper into Harlem, the number 9 began to feel smaller than it ever had before. By the time the first man realized he could not leave the way he came, Harlem had already decided the shape of the night. There were no barricades. No guns drawn in the open. No shouting. Just a series of small denials. A locked door here. A closed alley there. A familiar street that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The men adjusted, recalculated, tried to regain control through movement. But movement only tightened the space around them. One man attempted to duck into a bar he assumed would be neutral. The door opened just long enough for a look to pass between 2 locals. Then it closed again. No hostility. No explanation. Just refusal. Another man reached for a phone and stopped. He sensed it before he understood it, that any call he made would travel slower than whatever was already moving through the streets. Harlem didn't rely on wires. It relied on memory and obligation. The pressure became physical. Not fear yet. Discomfort. The kind that makes the shoulders tense, the jaw tighten. The men were skilled, but skill depended on predictable resistance. Here, resistance never arrived. Instead, they were being shaped. They began to disappear, not all at once, not dramatically. One man followed a path that ended in darkness and did not return. Another stepped into a doorway to adjust his coat and was simply no longer there when his partner circled back. No shots. No screams. Just absence. Those still moving felt it immediately. The city's silence grew heavier with each disappearance. Harlem was not hiding what was happening. It was normalizing it. Every block was held by people who owed Bumpy Johnson something. Protection once given. Lines once enforced. Respect never violated. These were not soldiers. They were neighbors. Shopkeepers. Men who remembered when chaos had threatened to tear the streets apart, and how one man had refused to let it. Bumpy had never promised safety without cost. He promised order. And order demanded participation. The remaining men understood now that there was no center to strike. No single room where Bumpy waited. The trap was distributed, stretched across stoops and storefronts, windows and hallways. Harlem itself was the structure. When two of them finally crossed paths deliberately, relief flickered. Numbers again. Something solid. They exchanged few words. There was nothing useful left to say. They tried to push outward together, choosing a direction at random. The street answered with stillness. Faces watched from a distance, calm and unafraid. Children were gone now. Windows were dark. Then someone stepped into their path, not threatening, not armed, just present. A pause. A moment long enough for understanding to settle. These men were not meant to continue. Somewhere nearby, another presence was approaching. Slower. Certain. Unavoidable. Bumpy Johnson did not hurry toward moments like this. He let them ripen. He allowed the weight of his absence to do the work first. By the time he entered, resistance was already gone. Only two men remained free enough to be seen. And they were about to understand why they had been allowed to stay that way. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the street without announcement. No entourage. No raised voice. Just the quiet certainty of a man who knew the night had already bent in his favor. The two men saw him at the same time. They recognized him immediately, though they had never met. That was the power of presence earned over years. Bumpy did not need to threaten. His calm carried history with it. He stopped a few feet away. Close enough to be heard without leaning in. Far enough to make it clear this was not a confrontation. "You're standing," he said, voice even. "That's not an accident." Neither man answered. Their weapons stayed where they were. Hands visible. Breathing shallow. They understood the rules now, though no one had spoken them aloud. Bumpy looked at each of them in turn. Not searching. Measuring. He knew fear when he saw it, but what interested him more was respect. Fear faded. Respect stayed. "You came here thinking numbers mattered," he continued. "They don't. Not here." The words were not sharp. They didn't need to be. Harlem listened through him. The message belonged to more than one man. He told them they would leave. Together. Walking. He told them they would repeat exactly what he said, and nothing else. Names would not be added. Details would not be embellished. This was not a story. It was a warning. "You tell them Harlem isn't empty," Bumpy said. "And it isn't loud. But it remembers." One of the men swallowed hard and nodded. The other followed. No argument. No pride left to defend. Bumpy stepped aside. The path opened, not wide, not welcoming, but clear. The city allowed it. That permission mattered more than mercy. As the two men walked away, they felt eyes lift from them, then slowly turn back to their own lives. Harlem relaxed without celebration. Order restored itself naturally. Bumpy did not watch them leave for long. His role was finished. He turned back toward his neighborhood, greeted softly by people who had already begun reopening doors and windows. No blood marked the street. No sirens followed. Yet the message would travel farther than any violence ever could. Two men walked out carrying something heavier than fear. They carried understanding. The two men did not run. They walked exactly as instructed, step for step, until Harlem released them completely. Only then did the weight settle in their chests. Not relief. Responsibility. They carried no proof. No scars that could be displayed. No story dramatic enough to impress careless ears. What they carried instead was certainty. And certainty moved faster than fear ever could. The message reached its destination unchanged. Harlem was not open ground. Bumpy Johnson was not a man you removed. He was a presence you accounted for. The warning did not threaten retaliation. It promised consequence. That distinction mattered. Meetings ended early after that. Plans were reconsidered. Names were spoken more carefully. Not because anyone admired restraint, but because they respected it. Power that didn't need noise unsettled men who relied on it. Back in Harlem, life resumed without ceremony. Bumpy Johnson returned to routine. He checked on people. Listened to grievances. Settled disputes before they hardened into violence. That was his real work. Not survival, but stewardship. No one asked him what happened to the others. They didn't need to. Absence spoke clearly enough. Harlem understood the cost of order and accepted it because the alternative had always been worse. Years later, people would argue about the details. How many men came? How many left? Where it happened? Those details were never the point. What endured was the lesson. That power rooted in community outlasted power built on fear. That a man who protected his people earned protection in return. That Bumpy Johnson did not rule Harlem by force, but by agreement. The warning traveled far, but its meaning stayed close to home. In Harlem, calm returned the way it always did, quietly, permanently, and on Bumpy Johnson's terms.